in that holiday period of 2007, I was sitting at home, and I'm not sure whether it was the lowest point, but it was a point where I was truly trying to find what was I going to manifest as next. It was going to be very hard to continue to get the kind of resources to fund risk-taking exploration. People were clearly not believing that there were other sites out there. There were talks of not even allowing digging at new sites because they clearly had failed, and I'd almost been a demonstration of that over 17 years. It was at that moment that I became the last human being on Earth to discover Google Earth. And there I was surfing and looking at these satellite images that were free. And I have to explain why that was such an epiphany for me. In the late 1990s, I'd been awarded a prize, the Research and Exploration Prize by the National Geographic Society. And it had been done for some of these other research and discoveries that I'd made in the middle 1990s and early 1990s in South Africa. And Gil Grosvenor, who was then the CEO, and Bill Allen, the editor, took me into a grand office and said, "You can have anything you want, within reason, to do anything you want as part of this prize, a research grant." I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to apply technology. Because right then, there was this incredible new technology that was becoming available. One was handheld GPSs that said that you could place your position with coordinates within like 15 meters on planet Earth. That was amazing to me. We used to have to measure by triangulation our position on a map until that point. Also, satellite maps were being made available by NASA, 30-meter pixels each one. They were hugely expensive. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. But that's what I did. I bought these things, and I started out exploring southern Africa for 3 years. And I found quite a few new sites outside of the region. I mapped, though, all the existing sites with this incredible new technology, and I ended up concentrating specifically on an area just outside of Johannesburg, where the site of Gladysville, where I discovered these first hominids years before, and where all these big discoveries were. I discovered 4 new cave sites that had fossils in them. Now that's pretty good because there'd only been about 14 or 15 known. So I had added a percentage, and this is probably the most explored place on the continent of Africa for these things. And I started working them. Of course, you know the end of that story because I didn't find much in those sites as we moved into the 21st century. So it was that context that I suddenly was looking at free satellite images, not with 15-meter resolution, but 5-meter resolution of this area. Well, after looking at my house, like everyone does the first time they do it, and then after looking at some of the places I saw that little window over to the left that you could put GPS coordinates in. And I had some of the most expensively obtained GPS coordinates on the planet to put in that window. And I typed them in, and I saw what everyone sees, that amazing Google Earth phenomena of flying from the sky and popping right down onto the point that coordinate is. And my coordinate, the first one, which I'd put in as Gladysville because I knew it better than any place on Earth, landed on nothing. It landed hundreds and hundreds of meters away from Gladysville. Second point I put in, same thing. Third, they were all useless. They were all wrong. I had wasted 3 years of my life. I had wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars of research grant. Did not take me long to Google why. The U.S. government had put deliberate error into those GPSs in the late 1990s for military purposes, and that, with the errors that were inherent in those handheld GPSs, had created a compounding error. Well, that was like adding low to low on my life at that moment. And so I spent the rest of December and January moving those points physically on Google from where they landed to where I knew they should be, because I could see these sites. I could see what they looked like. I knew where they were. I could locate them. It was one of the most important moments in the entire story of my scientific career, because it was in correcting that error that I began to see patterns. that I began to see that they fell in linear structures. I began to see the fossil sites clustered together. Caves might be in more random situations. And I also began to see and learn what a site would look like, all the different varieties. They didn't all look the same. And I began to think that if that's a site, that looks like a site, and this looks like a site. I knew it could not be true. I knew it could not be true because I had walked that area myself. So had everyone else, though, in the field for the last 80 years. But it was driving me insane, so much so that in March of that year, I printed out a little A4 sheet of targets. And I did what every human does. I started as far away from the place I knew best, the site of Glassville, because I knew there was nothing there, all the way in the city limits of Krugersdorp, 20 kilometers away from that point where these rocks sort of faded out into the urban sprawl. And on the first day out, I found 21 new sites. By July of that year, I'd found 600 new sites, including well more than 40 fossil-bearing sites. So imagine this in the magnitude of we went from 20 known sites to 60. And I was blown away. If that error had not occurred, if those GPS points had been right, I would have never gone through that process. I would have accepted that the terrain was as we see it, and I would have never. So if I had not failed in that earlier expedition, what I'm about to tell you happened to me would never have happened. On the 1st of August, I had moved back in by then to the area around Gladysville, and of course, by then, the entire area was covered with sites, caves, fossil-bearing sites. They were all over the place. We just missed them, all of us. The community of scientists at WITS, particularly the geologists, I began to rope into this. And I really thought that was where my career was going to go. This is a big deal. I'm suddenly offering decades, hundreds of years of resources to the science. So I corralled together a couple of geologists, but no paleoanthropologists. You know, it is surprising how many people are risk-averse in that sort of thing. And I really thought the contribution was going to be this mass of new potential to our database. And on the 1st of August of 2008, I was almost on the last sweep of the entire region. I was as close to Gladysville as you're getting. I was 1 kilometer away. 1.5 hill. And I saw some targets on Google Earth. I used to sit on Google Earth the night before, deciding where I was going to go. I'd find my targets, and then my dog Tao and I would get in the car, and there we'd go to that area. Out we'd go, and I'd walk it, target to target, looking at the terrain, finding things, marking one's map, taking pictures. And that's what I did on that morning. But I knew I wasn't going to find anything that morning, even though I had these targets, because I'd been in this valley. I'd been in this valley in the late 1990s as part of that National Geographic expedition, and I'd found one of those fossil sites in this valley. I had been there. But, you know, I was following this system by then, and it was almost like a Zen-like exercise to go out. And I was disappointed if I didn't find 20 caves a day when I was out there. And I drove in this valley and drove near these targets, which were only 50 yards off the road, and I knew the moment I stopped the car I was going to make a discovery, because I could see an old lime trackway that somehow I had missed in the 200 or 300 times I'd driven down that road before. Tao and I got out, followed this trackway up around this really rough terrain. The Dolomite's hard to walk on. The animals had carved a path along this old lime miner trackway because it was where they could walk to. I came to an old game fence. It's in a wilderness area. And there I crawled through this hole in the fence, and in front of me was the site of Malapa. It was just a little hole in the ground with some trees, and the first rock I turned over had an antelope arm in it. That's rare. Big mammal fossils. 1 kilometer from where I'd spent the last 17 years working, and I hadn't seen a fossil site right here. But I was on a mapping expedition, took photographs, some notes, looked around, saw there were fossils, went up the hill and found 46 new caves, right in the middle of the most explored area on planet Earth. I was shocked. When I went back to the lab, and this incredible tragedy had occurred to us. The week before, a little more than a week before this all occurred, the young man who was going to take over this position as director was killed in a motorcycle accident in London. And so here we were sitting with a lab that had already shifted direction, new postdocs hired that were going to be trained in lab things, and no leader. I was in my office, and I don't remember exactly what I was doing that morning, but a young man named Job Kibbe came into my office, sat down across from me, and said, "Would you be my postdoctoral supervisor?" And I looked up at him. It was a tragic moment. And I said, "No, you're a lab guy. You want to be a lab guy. I'm not a lab guy. I'm a field guy. But I've just found this site, and it is really bothering me. If you want to learn to be a field guy, let's go look and see what this site has to offer. And if it's what I think it is, I'll teach you to be a field guy." So on the 15th of August, we go back to the site. My dog Tao, Job, my then 9-year-old son Matthew. We arrive there, and I'm telling them the story how I discovered it. We walk up the hill, walk to the site. There's a little hole there where miners had found this site 100 years ago or so, and they put in 2-3 dynamite blasts, and then they'd done something that I've never seen before. They left it. They knocked a few rocks loose. One of the ones is the one that I'd found earlier. And I said, "Okay, guys, go find fossils. And when you find one, call me. I'll identify it, and let's see what the site has to offer." And with that, Matthew and Tao are gone, off into the bush. And Job and I were standing at the hole, and I said, "Job, I think that the miners left this because they probably did just what I did. They probably found it first. They start drilling holes and stuff. The foreman or someone walks up the hill. He finds all these other caves, and by the time he gets back, they've drilled the holes. He blasts. He doesn't see anything worthwhile. And he says, "Okay, move it up here." They destroyed almost every one of those other 46 caves. Destroyed. And as I finish saying that, Matthew shouts, "Dad, I found a fossil." He was 15 meters off the site in high grass. I could see he was holding a small rock. And just for a moment, I almost didn't go look, because I knew what he would have found. He would have found an antelope fossil, because at that time, the statistical numbers were, for every one of these early hominins we find, these human ancestor pieces, we find about 250,000 pieces of antelopes. We just don't find these things. My 9-year-old son, and encouraging fossil hunting. And I started walking towards him, and 5 meters away, I knew that his and my life were going to change forever. Because he was holding a small rock you have to visualize, and crouched down, and there on the outside of it was an S-shaped bone. And that S-shaped bone was a hominin clavicle. And the reason I knew that is very few mammals, first in Africa, have hominin clavicles. Bats have them because they fly. Moles have them because they dig, and primates have them. We're primates. And only amongst primates do humans and our ancestors have this very characteristic S shape. And at that time, I was probably one of the world's only experts on hominin clavicles. I'd done my Ph.D. on them. All 6 or 7 pieces, never a complete one, had been found. I did my thesis on the clavicle, the proximal humerus, and the scapula. And one of the reasons I did is there were no complete bones in the entire record of those, and it was about the only thing left to study, and it was all scraps. And I was looking at one. Matthew says I cursed. I don't believe that. I took the rock, and I was examining it, and it was one of those amazing moments where everything went black and white, and it really does happen to you. And everything, and I don't have any auditory memory of this, but I have a visual memory. As I turned the rock over, there, sticking out of the back, was the jaw and canine of an early human. Maybe one of the most characteristic teeth that you could be looking at. And I could see there were other bones in this block. And I realized immediately that we probably had the rarest of the rare partial skeleton. And we just don't find those. I called the South African Heritage Resource Agency to get permission to take it off, because the rules changed then. There's cell phone coverage there, of course. And we took it back to the lab, and within days we realized that indeed there was a partial skeleton there, a child, in fact. And we could see its molars weren't erupted, its epiphyses, its growth centers weren't fused. It was probably 11, 12, 13 years of age. And we were extremely excited. The first, effectively, rock we looked at has a skeleton in it. But I had to wait for the permit before I could go back. And on September 3rd, I was informed that I would receive the permit. And September 4th, every single person in our institute that had a master's or Ph.D. or in paleoanthropology, archaeology, biological anthropology, or who liked dogs went back out there, because we don't find these things ever. 99.9% of people who call themselves paleoanthropologists, the few thousand of us that there are, will never find one of these in the wild. And I think everyone had in the back of their mind that if a 9-year-old could do it in a minute and a half, this was our moment. We got back out there 3 hours later. We had found nothing you could definitively call a hominid. And we were devastated. I couldn't even put this little block back into this tiny little hole in the ground. It just, they weren't there. We broke for tea, and we were thinking of leaving. And I walked back over this hole where I situated it so the hole was between me and where that rock was. 15 meters away, and I was trying to imagine how could the rock get from here. And I was literally trying to visualize these miners. A blast goes off, rock flows out. How does that rock get from here to there? And I began to have that ugly feeling that, what if it came from one of those other caves? Fallen off a wagon. That's how it was so far away. We'd never know where it came from. It would be this treasure with no context. And the sun came just up enough that it shone on the back side of this wall that we'd all been in dozens of times. And I saw sticking out of the wall the proximal humerus of a hominid. Remember, I did my Ph.D. on them. I knew what they were. I didn't say anything. I climbed down into the pit. I got closer, and I realized that the shoulder blade, the scapula, was in articulation. I still didn't say anything. I put my hand on the wall, and 2 hominid teeth fell out of my hand. They were hanging loose in the loose dirt. Then I said something. It never occurred to me for a moment that that was not the child, Matt's child. Clavicle, proximal humerus. I only find out later, maybe a month later, that this was another skeleton, because never in history had 2 skeletons been found. And that started this adventure I've been in. It is the site of Malapa, which I would eventually call it, which means my home, has turned into perhaps the richest early hominid site ever discovered in the history of this planet. There are many, many individuals we haven't even excavated yet. There are organic remains. It's resulted in one of the most prolific research publication outputs that any team has produced in very short periods of time, because we operate on complete open access to all scientists. My scientific team grew from me, to over 100 scientists as you talk to me right now. It's probably one of the largest science programs in the world directed at these very specific questions. It would turn out to be a new species, one we never imagined existed. It's so different in its shape and morphology from things like Lucy or things that come after it like Turkana that I don't think any paleoanthropologist imagined this combination, this mosaicism in morphology. It's almost the opposite of what we had predicted, and that's why it's so exciting. It looks like a combination between later hominids and earlier hominids, and we genuinely found something new right on the surface of a site in the most explored area on planet Earth. So easy to see that a 9-year-old could pick it up. Not just another fragment of one of these things, but maybe the best ones that have ever been found, and people say we've discovered everything. Both my son Matthew and my daughter Megan go with me lots in the field, and so they've obviously picked up the skill of seeing fossils. However, some people say, oh, well, he just showed you a fossil, and he didn't know it was a hominid, and he'll tell you that. But I'll add a little bit different to that story. The clavicle is a very unusual bone. It's one of the few bones that is curved in human bodies, other than some ribs and some other parts of bone, but it's the only one with a double curvature like that. And it doesn't look like any bone in the body of antelopes or carnivores. There were other bones around. There were other rocks he could have showed me. I think he saw it was different. I think with that 9-year-old eyes, I think he saw it was different. Because I can tell you that when 14 professionals who know what they're looking for got out there, 3 and a bit hours later, we hadn't seen a one of what would turn out to be very many of these things lying around there. We missed it because we weren't prepared to realize that much of what we were looking at were exactly what we were looking for, because that had never occurred in the history of this science. So I give a lot of credit to Matthew's discovery, a tremendous amount. Another story has occurred almost exactly like that by the mentor of my mentor. In the same chair I took, Raymond Dart, when he opened the box in 1924 that contained the Tong child, he was one of the only people on the planet that could have recognized the little endocast that he pulled out of there. He was a comparative neuroanatomist in 1924 in the University of Witwatersrand, in the very situation that I occupied, and the same thing happened to me. Australopithecus sediba was a transformational moment when I first saw it, even though I didn't know it by name then, because we would later name it. I had a fantastic scientific career, but one full of huge ups and downs, which are typical of many people. I had rocketed to a position as chair of a very prestigious research unit at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, at a very young age, in my early 30s. I'd taken over from a very powerful and famous paleoanthropologist named Philip Valentine Tobias, and I had made some discoveries. When I first got to South Africa to do my Ph.D., I discovered 2 little hominid teeth. But those 2 teeth were the first new early hominids discovered, first new early hominid site, when the site of Gladysville, discovered in southern Africa in 48 years. They appeared in National Geographic, 2 teeth. That's how rare this stuff was at the time. I had done other work looking at what killed the Tong child. I'd looked at body proportions, but I had not made major hominid discoveries because they are just that rare. And I had got into the type of ups and downs and wars. I'd had units closed, units reopened. I'd had the most ferocious fights with colleagues. And one of the odd things about paleoanthropology is, what would normally be just a internal academic spat that might appear in a conference review ends up on the front pages of the New York Times in paleoanthropology, and those kind of things were happening to me. A lot of my ideas were always pushing edges, pushing boundaries. No one's ever made a great discovery by surfing behind a wave. And I was always pushing boundary. I also took a stance in the late 1990s about open access to fossils. You've got to remember, it's very important to remember that I'm almost the first generation of scientists, people my age and just maybe a year older, that were never without a computer. We're the first computer generation. I had one as a child. I've always had one. It makes us think differently. We're almost the Facebook generation of scientists. And in the late 1990s, there were some behavioral abnormalities within paleoanthropology that bothered me a lot. And I was in a very powerful position, a young man made director and sitting in one of the most powerful chairs in the science of paleoanthropology. And I had fossils that had been found by other people, albeit in the very distant past, under my control. And in this science, those are resources. And I decided to open them up, let everyone look at them. It now is called open access. We didn't have a name for it at that time, really. But I took a relatively public stance on that I was going to let people see these fossils. It was not the way it was done. The norm at that time was and I'm not criticizing it, I'm just explaining how the science worked, you would gather a small team of people around you when you had important fossils, and you would study them over years and years and years and years, and then at times you would pronounce on the analyses that you had carefully conducted. While that's not wrong in any way, shape, or form, it was different than the way my generation thinks about the value. We grew up in the age of where you have a Google or a Facebook or the internet, where we didn't know what anything was worth until you put it out there and began to establish its worth as a community, as you tested it, the robusticity of it as you went along. And so I was looking at the fossils the same way, and I said, I'm going to open the safe door. Well, it was probably a decade too early to say that, and it caused wars. It coincided with also the discovery of a very major fossil by a person older than me that worked for me. That caused tension and conflicts, particularly as I was publicly taking the stance, which of course would be threatening if someone didn't buy into it, and were some of the lowest periods. I literally, the fights that broke out eventually made me decide to split the unit and actually dissolve this thing that I had worked so hard to build over the previous 6 or 7 years. I then rebuilt. And as we moved into periods around 2003, 2004, some dramatic things changed in the world, and I ended up losing the second one again, even after I'd rebuilt it. Many people don't realize how much things had changed by sort of 2003, 2004, 2005. At that point, for the first time, we began to have readily accessible computers that could handle large databases. We had begun to work with 3D imaging of all kinds, from scans to surface scans to all this kind of things that were large data set things we just couldn't handle before then. And because my exploration efforts looking for fossils in various sites and stuff had not produced any really big hits, the push by things like the universities and colleagues was to move away from exploration. There was very much a real feel that we'd probably pretty much discovered every major fossil field in Africa. And in fact, some scientists even wrote that down at the turn of the millennia. And it wasn't a great time to be proposing to explore and push new, because we hadn't succeeded, theoretically being given the chance. All the big discoveries were in old sites. And so a whole re-look at what this field of science at my university was going on. There was going to be an institute created. It was clear I was not going to be the director of that. They were moving towards technology-based study. Let's study the sure thing, the fossils that we've already discovered, the fossils that were discovered decades and decades and decades ago, because that's what's getting on the cover of Nature and Science and all that sort of thing. I think that my generation of scientists, those computer generation of scientists, what would eventually be an internet generation of science, at least in our adulthood, we'd not reached sufficient power within organizations to activate. I was by far and away the youngest person who had reached a position as director at that point. And you know, the community has to be ready for certain messages often, and timing is often everything. I was still an extraordinary believer in that there was more out there to be discovered. I just wasn't demonstrating it. Of course, I'm in a field where you never find what you're looking for. So it was one of those catch-22 moments. The university began this search for a new director to lead us into the technological era. I began casting about for my next phase in life. I dabbled in looking at presenting some science education shows as a sort of field explorer type thing, because I'd always loved and passionately believed in the public communication of science. I was continuing to rise my career. I was given a promotion. I became the reader in Human Evolution and the Public Understanding of Science, which is interesting. It's clear in this period where my mind was in that. We eventually found a new director, which was ironically a person who'd been a postdoctoral student in my very unit. As these things go, the youth become closer and closer to you in age as technology advances, and he was destined to come take over. They began hiring people, lots of young people to fill these postdoctoral positions, looking at the equipment and such. And it was all towards the end of 2007. I've never been a believer that there is any such thing as failure. Failure is about an education. It's just up to you to see what you learned there. There is no situation where you can discover something, an antelope fossil, anything that is not immensely valuable to us as humans to understand. We're just not smart enough at any one given moment to recognize what the question is. The pressure of colleagues and your society you exist in, whether it's academic in my case or society, business, whatever it is, it's that pressure. It's that enormous pressure of what they perceive as success that causes the lows. I never thought I was failing. I never for a moment thought I was failing. I am one of those scientists that has been fortunate enough to have something truly extraordinary happen to me. I thought I had made big discoveries before. I thought I'd made contributions to science, incremental or major. I only realized after this, when truly a discovery of magnitude occurs, that's so much bigger than you are, that it doesn't need justification. You don't have to tell anyone how big it is. And that was the moment I had to make the decision. Do I keep this for myself, or do I stick to what I had gone through hell for in those wars of 99, 2000, 2001? And I would like to think that there wasn't a moment where I said, "My precious." And if there was, it didn't last very long. I fortunately stuck to that belief that there was a better way to do this, and I opened it and brought in a great team which grew osmotically in a way that people could imagine. I mean, to over 100 scientists now. That is in no time at all. And publishing magnificent papers in the highest quality journals and really, I think, contributing to our understanding of something about where we come from. These fossils have taught us two sort of big streams. One is that idea that there's not more out there to be discovered is wrong. Whatever they are, that idea is wrong. We need to build a generation of explorers and field scientists that go out and find more of these, because sitting in the most explored area on this planet for those very things is sitting these things on the surface. That's one thing it taught us. It's not a lesson about human evolution, it's a lesson about human behavior. Lesson about human evolution is that we don't know what's going on. We thought we had this figured out. We thought it was a relatively neat package. Okay, we might have said it's bushy here or it's bushy there. This is saying something. There were other experiments that were so different from what our ideas were that there must be other stories going on. This is not a bush. It's not a tree. It's like a braided stream of complexity that we also, it has taught us, regardless of what Australopithecus turns out to be in that braided stream of evolution, that we cannot use small bits and pieces to build a whole. If I had found any one area of anatomy of sediba, I would have probably named 3 or 4 different species from the different pieces. The ankle would be an ape. The rest of the foot would be a human. The pelvis would be a human. The spine would be an ape. The arms would be an ape. The hand would be a Homo erectus. The skull, the teeth would be the genus Homo, Homo habilis. The brain in its back would be an Australopithecine, and front something advanced. I mean, you can't use parts to interpret the whole unless you have the whole. We need more skeletons. Where does it fit? We don't know. And I think it teaches us that we shouldn't maybe ask that question yet about any of these things. We can speculate. It looks like a perfect transition between some early Australopithecine and Homo erectus, but maybe not the ones we found. And that's exciting because we're at a explosively transitional moment. It must be like for when scientists realized they had a part of the periodic table. They knew the rest was there. They just hadn't found it yet. That's where we are. I'd set a group of explorers out to look for fossils, but instead of doing the traditional going over the surface of the area in this cradle of humankind where I found things like sediba and other great discoveries have been made in the past, I decided to send them underground. The first part of the team was not physiologically appropriate to actually get into some of the very tight spaces, and so we enlisted some amateurs, two of them in fact, Rick Hunter and Steve Tucker, who are quite slim, very fit and a little bit insane explorers. And on September 13th, they went into one of the best known cave systems in the entire region, if not all of South Africa, the Rising Star system. They went off map though. They found a place at the top of a collapse we call Dragon's Back, and there they looked down a 7.5-inch slot. Now imagine they're already 100 feet underground. They're looking into this slot, and of course, what do? They go into it. And they go down it about 50 feet and drop into a chamber. And in that chamber are bones scattered across the floor. Then they're bones that they thought were the kind that I was looking for, and their camera didn't function. So they had to come back out. It was about a 4.5-hour trip at that time. They told me that they thought they'd found something, but I said, bring me pictures. I'm not going to believe you unless I see pictures of this, because I get that kind of thing all the time. People call you up and say they found a skull and it's a plastic baby doll head or something that they got out of their backyard. And I forgot about it. And October 1st, about 9 o'clock in the evening, my door buzzer went. I answered the intercom. And Pedro, who was a student that I had enlisted as sort of the team leader, was on the other end. He said, "You're going to want to let us in." And I almost didn't, because it was kind of a creepy voice like that. In they came, lifted up a laptop, and there I saw a picture that I thought I'd never see. There, sitting on this photograph, was a jawbone that I could see was a primitive hominid, but was just lying there on the floor. Next picture was a skull. Next picture, a series of bones of a body, it looked like. I'd never seen anything like that in all of my career, just lying there on the floor. And so we celebrated a little. I couldn't sleep that night, picked up the phone at 2 a.m., called National Geographic. They funded an expedition that would start 1 month later with 6 volunteer scientists who just happened to be women from all over the world who came without knowing what they were going to do, literally risking their lives. A 60-person expedition in the field. Within a week, we had the richest hominid site ever discovered in the history of South Africa. And by the end of a 21-day expedition, we'd found more fossils of primitive hominids that had been discovered in the entire history of the search for human origins in all of Southern Africa for the last 90 years. And we left thousands in the chamber. It's probably the richest site ever discovered in the world. It's like our version of Tutankhamun's tomb. I thought there was a skeleton. I couldn't believe it. I thought there was one skeleton. This is a field of fragments. We don't find these things. And I'd already had my lottery ticket punched with sediba. I had my skeletons from that discovery. I went after this second one with all the expectation of a fragmented skeleton that we would get out of some species. I never in the world expected that chamber to have that richness, and I really didn't expect to find another new species. literally, as the first pieces came up, the results were completely unexpected. It didn't look anything like the fossils I thought I saw on the photographic images. And almost from that moment as well, my colleagues and I, sitting there in the science tent, were pretty sure we'd never seen anything like this before. Homo naledi tells us a few things. One, that we should have an expectation of strangeness, that there are things out there we haven't found. There are lineages that are certainly out there that we haven't seen. Maybe ghost lineage is the word, something coming from deep time that was invisible until we see the species, and perhaps we should expect more of those. Second thing it teaches us is that there's mosaicism in human origins, that the simple expectation that when you look at one part of the body, you can tell what another part of the body is going to look like, that's wrong. Sediba started that story. Homo naledi says that absolutely. And the third thing I think it teaches us is that we should be very careful about proclaiming everything we find as a human ancestor. Human relative is probably a better term, because it's clear now that to get to us, there were lots of different experiments. So the easiest way to sort of describe Homo naledi is it's not a human first. You've got to get that out of your mind. But it is standing on two legs. Imagine something standing on two legs. It's probably about 5 feet tall, but ultra thin. If you were looking at it across a room, you'd immediately know you're not looking at a human, or if you are, there's something wrong with them, because perched atop that 5-foot body is going to be a pinhead, a head literally with a brain the size of an orange. The shoulders would be high and almost a brought up sort of held like an ape would hold its shoulders. But then you'd notice that the arms would be more human proportion. The hands would look like a human hand, except they'd be held and curved out at the end, so that they wouldn't be flat. They would just be sort of more like an ape at the end, but human proportioned. When you got down to the hips, they'd be sort of flared, but again, a very slender body, and then long, skinny legs, which at the very end of that, a human-like foot. It's kind of strange that, we've just discovered Homo naledi, but because of the abundance of fossils that we have, 1,550 elements we brought out, 15 individuals, we know probably more about it than almost any other species of ancient human relative ever discovered. And so we can say that Homo naledi was a climber, but we don't know what it's climbing. It has these very different hands than any kind of hominid we've ever seen before, with those long curved fingers. We know it's a long distance walker. It's got these long legs, and it's walking in much the way a human is. We can even see that in the way the foot and ankle are constructed, but it's doing it somehow a little bit differently because the pelvis is constructed differently. So you've got a climbing, long distance walker. But perhaps what's most amazing about it is that we've also had a glimpse into its behavior. We've hypothesized, after eliminating pretty much everything else, that Homo naledi was deliberately disposing of its dead, which means it's got a mind that has the capacity that we previously thought was not only unique to humans, but perhaps identified humans, the concept perhaps of recognition of self-mortality. Everyone wants to know where this animal, this non-human species, fits in the human family tree, and the answer is we don't know. And we haven't been grandstanding. We could probably say, hey, this is at the base of the genus Homo, and everything else that comes after it comes out of it. But one of the messages that comes out of Homo naledi is you probably shouldn't be drawing simplistic family trees anymore. We don't know where it comes from. It's clear from its mosaic morphology that it has some deep roots back in some very early primitive ancestor. But does it come out of something like Lucy? Well, the parts of the body it says it could, and then parts that say, gee, it might even be primitive to that. So there could be some even earlier ancestor we haven't discovered yet that gives rise, it splits away, and then you have these different experiments going on down through time. Now, that doesn't mean because that those are independent experiments that just go away, because with recent studies of genetics, we now know sometimes things can come back together. We carry Neanderthal DNA inside of us. So there's a chance that there could be divergent and then hybridization at different times. So you're picking up the best of different things as evolution occurs. But the important part of that is Homo naledi says that our record isn't complete enough, and we should probably just step back for a bit and find more fossils. We were faced with a dilemma. About day 4, we realized that there was nothing in this chamber but hominids. All of us have degrees in archaeology, forensic anthropology, and we kind of knew what it meant to see a truly monospecific assemblage. It's rare to the point of unique in the paleontological record, well, except for one species, Homo sapiens. This wasn't Homo sapiens. We knew that very early on. We knew it was primitive. And so we began trying to eliminate things. We could easily eliminate eventually that it wasn't a predator. There were no marks of that. There was no scavenging. We knew that it wasn't a mass death assemblage because they had come in one after the other. We could tell that from studies of how the bones were laid out and also how they were weathering. We knew that they hadn't died in some collapse. We knew they weren't washed in there. We could see that from the sediments. We went through everything. And we were eventually left with this one hypothesis, that this non-human species of animal was doing something that we previously thought only humans did, deliberately disposing of its dead. Up until September 10th, when we announced that we have a species of non-human animal that deliberately disposes of its dead in a ritualized fashion, at least that's the best hypothesis, it was thought that that was not only unique to humans, but perhaps identified us. Now we have to rethink what it means to be a human. So to put yourself at the moment that an event like this happens, you have this chamber that's in the dark zone. It is deep in a cave. We know that because there's nothing else in there, and we can see that there aren't wind-blown sediments and such. So the entrance is difficult to get to. And in fact, there's some evidence that the entrance is the same one we come down, that little narrow chute, because there are remains at the bottom. So if we're at this moment, perhaps a group of them are carrying a body, and somehow they are working their way up in the dark, up this collapse that we call Dragon's Back, risking their lives perhaps. Maybe they pass the body up bit by bit, climbing ahead of each other to lift what must have been a heavy weight. If it was an adult, it would weigh 40, 50 kilograms. So this is a big animal in a big event. They reach the top of the chute, and that's where our story kind of stalls into speculation, because we don't know what happens then. Do they drop the body down this little slot, and does it hang and begin to deteriorate and fall into here? Or do they descend that chute as well, somehow moving the body down and entering and placing the body in the dark zone of this deep cave? It's hard to imagine them doing that in the pitch black. And so there is some implication that perhaps, again, this is pure speculation until we can discover some chemical evidence of this, but perhaps they were lighting fires too. But think about that. Here's an animal with a brain the size of an orange that does that with its dead, but we're kind of left with that inevitable hypothesis, at least on the evidence we have at hand. Down in that naledi chamber, we left thousands of remains. The floor is quite literally comprised of the bones of Homo naledi. We have 15 individuals out. We recovered 1,550 specimens so far from just sweeping the top of the floor, what had actually just moved up and settled out of the dirt, and a excavation of about 1 yard by 10 inches. Can you imagine the extent of the fossils that we've left behind? Right now, we already have this basically head-to-toe look at Homo naledi. We have it from near fetal-aged individuals. We have infants, toddlers, children. We have teens, young adults, and the elderly. We have most areas repeated in multiple individuals, and many of those bones are very complete, but some areas are not as complete as others. So we would like to get a little bit more and reconstruct those areas that are missing, but we're also going to leave remains there because technology is changing at an incredible rate. And we have a chance to actually leave a gift for future generations of scientists. I mean, with what we can do today, it would seem like a miracle to a scientist 25, 30 years ago. What they're going to be able to do in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, who knows? And so we have an obligation to leave part of this, at least, and probably a significant part of it, as a time capsule for those scientists that aren't even born yet. We published these in a refereed journal. There are something like 60 authors on the two papers, one looking at taxonomy, the other looking at the context. There have been a couple of scientists who have jumped out and said, no, this is Homo erectus. And in fact, they've said it's primitive Homo erectus. And some of the media jumps up and says, see, so there's now a debate going on about the taxonomy. You guys got it wrong. What most people who aren't scientists don't understand, though, is that's kind of exactly what we're saying, too. If you say that Homo naledi is a primitive Homo erectus, then by definition, you're placing it at the base and root of our genus. The debate of whether it's a new species or not, well, that's a semantic debate about how we scientists talk about variation and differences. We say that there is too much variation to include naledi within Homo erectus, because if you do, you extend it beyond any known species that's ever existed. Plus, it's got unique characters never before seen in any hominid, like its thumb, like parts of its femur, but those are technical arguments. So what sounds like this big disagreement about taxonomy is actually a bunch of scientists agreeing with each other and just arguing over subtle words. I think what Homo naledi says is we've got to stop using just one part of anatomy to proclaim species. Because of the scarcity of the ancient human relative fossil record, and it has been a field of scraps, most of the field has relied on just the head and often just dentition to identify what a species is. Homo naledi says you can't do that. Sediba said you can't do that. We used an entire body to describe a new species, and I would say to colleagues who disagree, we're going to have to do that. You need to see the whole thing. That doesn't sound very fair, though, if you've got a 90-year record that's comprised of isolated teeth or a bit of a mandible or a jaw. But these fossils are demanding that we start doing the things we do, that is, taxonomic classifications, not on bits and pieces, but from head to toe. What these discoveries have taught me in a very real way is that people like me need to open our minds to possibilities. Clearly, the previous 17 years to discovering sediba, I had a case of backyard syndrome. That is, that I wasn't seeing what was right in front of me. When I discovered Malapa, that was less than a mile from where I'd spent the majority of the last 17 years looking. It was so easy to see, a 9-year-old could see it. And that's the trick. A 9-year-old could see it. Because they don't have an expectation of not discovering something. I then stopped exploring, concentrated my energy on the science of studying sediba. And it was only after 5 years that I went, wait a second, we need to be back out there. And within a month and a half, naledi had been discovered. And it was right under our noses all the time. The Dinaledi chamber in the Rising Star System is less than a mile from the richest site for human origins on the planet, site of Sterkfontein. I sat in my command center looking at this site as bone after bone after bone came up that were lying there on the floor of a cave that none of us had looked at because that's not the way they're supposed to be. So what goes on in my mind? Don't have expectations of what you're going to discover. Stop expecting it to look like what you know. Keep your mind open and stop and look at everything. You know, I don't actually listen to music while we're conducting these expeditions. And there's a couple of reasons why. Because there's almost no time. And I know that might sound funny to people, but these events, and I've got to go back in my mind to this Rising Star expedition. People's lives were at stake at every moment. This was incredibly dangerous. I was personally taking a decision that I was risking people's lives to send them in and out of these chambers constantly to discover fossils, to bring bones up. And so when I set up that expedition model and we'd laid the 3.5 kilometers of cable and we had a command center and science tent and caving tent and all those sort of things, every moment of my mind was focused on those cameras and those audio systems, watching and thinking about those people. There wasn't time for music in that. It was an extraordinary event. And then, as we started making these huge discoveries, it wasn't a skeleton, it was multiple skeletons, and then we realized that what was happening to us was extraordinary. We knew we were in perhaps one of the most remarkable events any paleontologists or archaeologists have ever faced. That was music to me. I have always lived my life thinking there's more to be found, that we don't know everything. Yeah, that's tough. It's tough in a field where 99.9% of the people never make a discovery of one of these things in the wild in their entire life. It's hard to keep going. I went for 17 years finding bits and pieces. But there is always that thing in me that says there is something else out there. To be fair, I never visualized this happening to me. I never visualized sediba. You know, I would have been happy with a mandible, a jaw, piece of an arm, anything prior to 2008. Then there were skeletons. There is something in me that says that's not enough, and so we keep looking. And then naledi came along. There's more out there. I know that for a fact, because I also learned a lesson from sediba. We didn't stop exploring after naledi, and there are more things. Those are not miracles, and there's more to be found. I have no idea what we're going to discover. I kind of know the areas we're working in. We plan and make logistics around certain types of environments. You learn from your discoveries, so you know what types of things there are. But the beauty of it is, I have no idea that as we're speaking right now, my phone, which is turned off, could be ringing, and one of my explorers saying, "Hey, you gotta see this." That's the beauty of it. I have no idea. Sediba was an extraordinary discovery. It changed my life. You know, suddenly I was part of a club of explorers and paleoanthropologists who had been privileged to be involved with a major discovery that was going to sit in textbooks forever. And that changed my life. It changed my life in a science-y way. It changed my life in a public way. Suddenly you're a public figure in a different way. Naledi was so much more extreme than that. I mean, when it went viral on Twitter, when it started trending, when it came out on the cover of National Geographic, when the scientific papers had 250,000 reads for a science paper, when I would go to schools or into auditoriums or lectures, and you gotta remember, this is just 9 weeks ago. And you get standing ovations, and you get kids crying, and I watch them cluster around these underground astronauts and see them as the heroes that they are. It's not a rock star that's there. These are scientists. My life is entirely changed. Homo naledi has done something that I thought would never happen to me as a paleoanthropologist. I went into a field to study and interpret bones. Suddenly, not only are there bones, but you've got a discovery that's giving you insight into behavior in a way that I never anticipated. The idea that we're getting a window into another species' mind from this chamber. That's amazing. That's something that I think the whole world is going to have to think about. You've got something here, a discovery that's making us question our own humanity. I guess I don't know how I feel about that. I haven't had enough time to digest the effect of that in something that I wasn't really prepared for. I'd spent my life as a biologist, a paleontologist. And now I have to also think like a philosopher. That's kind of neat, though. I think about that a lot. What would it be like if we're sitting here in New York City a million years from now and an archaeologist plunges a excavation in this? What would they find? They wouldn't find us. They'd find the remains of our way of doing things. They'd find lots of other animals. They'd find here in New York City pigs and cows and sheep and goats and cats and dogs and birds, and we'd be absent. They'd find our buildings. They'd find the rooms we live in. They'd find the clothes we wear. They'd find the tools we use. Unless they got really lucky and bumped into that 0.000 whatever percent that's a cemetery or a morgue. That's kind of a strange way to think about the events that are transpiring now. Did we just get lucky in the naledi chamber and find that minute percentage? And what must else be out there? So when you look at the future, looking back at the past, they'll only see our things, our actions, what we do. They'll almost never see us. I grew up in a little town called Sylvania, Georgia. We would stay there during the winter, and we'd migrate between that and Savannah, Georgia. It had about 800 people. We were 13 miles out on a farm, and it was an extraordinary part of what molded me, that outdoors lifestyle, the idea to observe nature, the freedom that gave. It also made me want to see a bigger world, and I think it was a big part of what made me leave America eventually as I explored America and then realized that there was this vast world out there that was waiting to be discovered. The idea of finding things and looking for things was always clearly a sort of inner part of me. I come from a long background of people who look for things. My grandfather was an oil wildcatter. My deep ancestry comes from pioneers who were sod busters in the Kansas Territory, so risk takers, things like that. And so I was always collecting something. It might have been wildlife. It might have been where I would collect turtles or try to raise fish that I caught in a pond, or collecting arrowheads in plowed fields. That sort of looking for things, finding things, and it has always been, I think, something that's been a very big part of me. The idea that there are things that other people don't see all over the place, even in my own backyard or as I walk through the woods, always intrigued me, and I think has been a big part of me. My father was a real estate broker and sold insurance, but in a small town way. So it's a very different thing to what some people might think of a large office block. My mother was a math teacher, taught first in schools and then eventually in a small local college. They both were passionate about education, but also gave me a lot of freedom just to be. I wasn't the easiest child, though. I wasn't. I went through quite a lot of academic ups and downs until I found what I loved. I was an Eagle Scout, and that was a huge part of my life. Scouting was because it began to give me um, a purpose to some of the things I was doing, whether it was collecting merit badges or things like that. I was also involved in 4-H heavily. I became president of Georgia 4-H, and that was the first thing that actually began to start helping me reach out into the bigger world, if you will. Some things that might surprise people when they see me now. I was involved in pig farming. I used to do showmanship with cattle and pigs and real country things. I was involved in dairy contests. But maybe more importantly to what actually happened was I was involved in the public speaking parts of it, where they began to engage in how to teach you to communicate. And then I started to meet scientists through the projects and the competitions. One of the things that happened to me through 4-H was that I began to become interested in wildlife conservation and biology. I found out there was an endangered species in my region called the gopher tortoise, and that took me to national competitions. And it also introduced me to the first scientists I'd ever met. And they were hugely formative, and I ended up starting the first gopher tortoise preserve in the state of Georgia. It's now the state reptile, and it was a big part about teaching me not just about passion when you find something, but about the process of what you do to study something or to actually make something happen. Also taught me a little bit about politics, which getting some other people to become interested in something and assist you in accomplishing something. Anyone who has parents wouldn't be surprised that when a young man or woman decides to do law or medicine or something, because isn't everyone supposed to be a lawyer? Because that's what the world needs, another lawyer. I don't mean that in any harmful way, but it's true. The pressures of that are enormous to please other people. And like I think many, many young people, the idea of being what other people want you to be is the easy way out. And so I got into Vanderbilt University on a naval ROTC scholarship, and I started to look and take all those pre-law courses, Economics 101. Anyone who's ever done that will remember them. And after the first few, I was ready to die because I didn't understand it. I didn't believe it. I didn't like it. But here I was on a scholarship to do this. I was terrified. But one of the great things about a lot of the liberal arts colleges that people don't appreciate as much are those electives. And I had, of course, gravitated to geology and even videography and a couple of other things. And I love them. My transcript looked sort of like F.D., F in my core subjects of what I was supposed to be, and then A, and everything I was taking as elective. And I reached a critical point where it was literally one of those situations where I was going to fail out of college, or I had to do something radical in my life. And I had one of those incredible moments when I met a person who didn't realize how influential they would be in my life, in the young lieutenant who was my advisor in the Naval ROTC. Because I went in on the verge of failing out. Now, I was lucky enough at that time that we had the 2-year process, so I'd gone a year and a bit into it. So I wouldn't have to go enlisted, but I was in trouble. And I went to him and I said, gosh, it's not working. And I think I'm maybe going to drop out for a while, maybe enlist in the Navy and find myself, because this isn't working. And this young lieutenant who had my life in his hands, he could have told me, and it would have been in his interest, because they're recruiting officers in some ways, to say, absolutely, or, he leaned across the table and he said, what is this that when you look at it? And he had my transcript. He shoved it across, and, I was like, failure? That was... And he said, no, look at it again. Don't look at the D's and F's. Look at that again. And I said, I don't see it. And he said, I see your passion there. I see what you love. You just don't realize it. He said, you're not enlisted material. You need to find your love. And he said, I will let you out of here right now as long as you promise me to go do what you love. And he signed my release papers. I put my stay at Vanderbilt in abeyance, and I walked out the door into a very interesting period, but where I then found that thing and never looked back. I ended up in Savannah, Georgia, and I walked into a local TV station and said, may I see the manager? And he said, the secretary, for some reason, said no, and as they would. And I was standing there devastated, and he walked by. He said, who's this? And I said, I'm Lee Berger, and I'd like to work for you for free. And he went, what? And I said, really, I'm just, I'm fascinated by this. I'd had one video course, and I loved it in college during that period. And he said, I can't let you work for free. He said, but, we've got the worst job in this place, which is the studio cameraman thing. I'm desperate to fill this. If you're willing to work for minimum wage and learn that thing, I'll do it. 3 months later, I was the head cameraman in that division. 4 months later, I was in charge of, in the news camera division because I saw how exciting it was. I ended up in some wild things. I got hired by the leading station within a couple of months, started the first night news program in Savannah, Georgia, ended up saving a woman's life because I was caught in a weird circumstance where the police had gone upriver in the Savannah River when they heard that a woman had fallen in the river, and I ended up downstream. That's probably my Eagle Scout, and where I ended up downstream all alone. And there went a woman going by. And my job was to film, and I had to make a decision instantly. Film this woman, but the next stop is the Atlantic Ocean or not. And I dropped my camera, which they were very fragile and very expensive back then, and jumped in and brought her in. And that was an amazing moment for me because it brought a lot of attention to me nationally. It occurred just after an event where some reporters had filmed a woman who'd set herself on fire. And I ended up as this young guy amongst professional reporters in this national debate of right or wrong if the press intervenes. I wasn't prepared for it. I realized how woefully unprepared I was to suddenly be launched into the profession of journalism. It wasn't what I was doing. I was just finding myself. And so at the peak of that, I said, you know what? I need to go find myself. And so I ended up doing a couple of odd things, working for my father's company for a little bit, and then I said, I need to get back to university. My passion is in something, and I knew it was science. I knew it was probably geology, but I didn't have it then. So I went to get my grades back up to a tiny little place called East Georgia College. And there I met another group of those incredibly precious people who'd chosen to go to one of these small colleges to teach. And there I met a geologist who just exploded the world of fossils that were all around me. I had no idea in the place that I lived, this low country of what was around me. I met these passionate English professors and mathematicians. My grades, of course, rocketed because it wasn't work anymore. I stayed there for a brief period, got my grades back, went down to Georgia Southern University because it was the only place I could afford. I was on my own on this one. I'd had my scholarship chance. And I walked into another place that was just full of these rare, passionate academics and scientists. I had by that time read a book that fundamentally changed my life, and it was Lucy. I actually stole it from the library at this little college. I couldn't put it down. Lucy was discovered in the middle 1970s. This book was written in the early 80s, and this adventure was about 87, 88, 89 that's occurring. And I actually took this book from the library. I did eventually pay the fine and put it back, but I couldn't let it down. I had found a thing, and there was one line in there that struck me when Don, who would eventually become a great friend and mentor of mine, said that these early hominid fossils are effectively the rarest sought-after objects on Earth, and there's something like a 1 in 10 million chance of finding one. And I had just before then been thinking of becoming a dinosaur paleontologist or something, and that line so intrigued me, because the first thought that came in my mind was not, gee, who would want to go into a field of science where you have no chance of finding something? But there's a field that you can make a difference with even the smallest discovery. And I wanted to make a difference. And so I began pursuing that. I registered at Georgia Southern. I started doing a degree in archaeology. I did a degree in geology because I realized that if you want to be a paleoanthropologist, and I just learned that term effectively through that you needed these skills, and particularly if you wanted to be in the field. And through a series of things that happened that were very both coincidental and I manufactured, I ended up meeting Don, and he liked me, and we hit off very well. He invited me to go work with him as a geological assistant at Olduvai Gorge. I was graduating, but I was graduating offline, so I was making my graduate school applications, but I was not going to be in the normal system because I had not entered on the same time as a normal student, and so I was about to get my dream fulfilled to go to Africa, and 2 months before we were to depart for Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, he calls me and he says, "Lee, it's not going to happen. I've lost my permit." I was devastated. For some reason, Don took pity on me with all the problems he was having, and he contacted Richard Leakey, who was involved with the Harvard University Kubi-4 Field School at his research station in northern Kenya. And they accepted me into this program. I ended up landing at last-minute entry into this program, went through all the orientation, ended up at Kubi-4 in Kenya. My first morning there, I couldn't sleep. Here I was. These are the fossil fields of Africa. I woke up early. All the rest of the students stayed asleep, and I walked in. I saw a light on in this small encampment in the middle, right on the edge of Lake Turkana, in the middle of Africa, and there I met a man, John Kimmingich, one of Richard Leakey's fossil hunters. And he had chatted to me for a moment. He was having tea. It was probably 4:30 in the morning. He said, "You want to go look for fossils with me? I'm going out now." I said, "Of course." Over the next several hours, he taught me how to find these anomalies, how to see these things. And as we were walking back to the Land Rover, 11 o'clock in the morning, it gets too hot to work. 100 meters from the Land Rover, I looked down, and there was a piece of a femur, this leg bone of an early hominid. I found my first hominid, 1 in 10 million chance. My first day, it was completely I was hooked. Don Johansson's discovery of Lucy is important in the history of this field of science in a great many ways, and something that has actually, with these recent discoveries, tied me intimately to him forever. Lucy was the first skeleton. People who aren't in this sort of field do not understand that we are a science of scraps. We are a science of fragments. These are potentially the rarest sought-after objects on Earth, and there are just little pieces of them that we have to build this record. Those skulls you see in National Geographic and on television, they are rare beyond belief. There are literally just a few dozen. None are complete. Most of the record is made up of isolated teeth. Maybe 80 plus 90% of the record. The postcranial elements from the head down are made up of fragments. For most of them, we don't have a complete one. And Lucy was the first time we had the remains of the head of an individual with its body, even part of it. And it was a transformational moment. Suddenly we were building not as much guesswork. When you just got a piece, you can be accused, and potentially rightfully so, of a lot of reconstruction. There she was. It was huge in our field. They are so rare as to almost be beyond belief. By the time I made this recent discovery, there had still been only perhaps 7 partial skeletons ever discovered in the history of early hominid, Lucy being one, the Turkana boy discovered by Richard Leakey. There had been Littlefoot in South Africa, still not excavated from the ground. The remainders are so fragmentary, they don't even have names or numbers. I mean, we're talking little tiny things. One little baby called the Dakika child. Tiny fragments, but they are the most precious things we have. And so it is interesting that the 2 people who've been very important to me, Don Johansen and then Richard Leakey, in my early career, who guided me, were both the finders of skeletons, and I've of course joined them with this, but with this incredibly privileged abundance that's happened with discoveries at Malapa. I think that when you look at the idea of disbelief, with here we come back the first bit with a bit of a femur. Everyone's jealous of things and stuff like that, but most people at that age are just thrilled when exciting things happen, no matter who does it or who gets it. We tend to only wear ourselves out of our sense of communal joy at success when we get a little bit older. But it was from it, and not everyone on that field school was going to be a paleoanthropologist. In fact, almost none of them were. They were there for the experience. I was there to be a field paleoanthropologist. So I don't think there was that much of a hint of jealousy or anything. It was generally enormously exciting. Our field school had found a hominid, and that's a big deal because not all of them did. Every single person is interested to know who their parents are, who your grandparents are, who your great-grandparents are. Genealogy websites and that work are hugely popular. Why? The reason is because every human being on this planet at some point realizes that the people who they descend from in the past carry traits and behaviors that are now part of them. And as we try to understand ourselves as humans, something only humans can do, we explore our inner selves. We're looking for causality, reason. We want to know not only why we look physically like this, but often the more important, why we behave like this. Well, people like me just do that in the deep depths of time. These bones that we're finding are of individuals that lay somewhere in our deep family tree. They're teaching us. When we look at their behavior, when we examine their physical being, when we learn about the environments they lived in and how they interacted and how certain aspects of them evolved, we're learning about us, but not just me, selfishly, or you, but about every living human being on this planet. What's not to be interested in? We do a funny thing in modern academia as we train the future generation of scientists. We teach them to do research from day one. It's the priority. They enter research labs. It's all we do. We teach them to write papers. We teach them to do statistics. We teach them to analyze data, to think scientifically, which will form about 10% of what they actually do in their daily lives. The other 90% will be communication, either with students or other colleagues or with the public out there. We're educators in many ways. We are the communicators of science, and we never teach them to do it. And we should. Every single person who goes into science should be taught to communicate to communicate with their colleagues in civilized and dignified manners, but to communicate with the public, because this is for the public that we do this. This is for the people of the world. And then the other thing, which we don't teach them, is the principle of exploration. We don't give them the tools to be adventurers. Whether they're going to be adventurers in the lab or whether they're going to be out there looking for whatever it is they're looking for in any field of science, we don't actually teach them those skills. We don't teach them how to fix a tire. The things I learned in scouting or 4-H in rural Georgia, we don't teach them how to not be killed by a large dangerous animal, or to cross a country border with a passport, or to understand the geology that sits around them, whether they're studying chemistry, plants, or animals. It's the earth that these things live on. We don't teach those things, and we need to do that too. We need to open our eyes. We need to remove backyard syndrome. Backyard syndrome is something a lot of people don't think about, but it's critically important that we get rid of it no matter what you're in, science or business. Backyard syndrome is quite simply, if I asked you to draw your backyard or substitute your living room or bedroom or kitchen right now, or I asked you to draw this room, look around, and then leave this room and draw. You draw this room more accurately than you would draw any of those things you're most familiar with. And the reason is that you would amalgamate them into kind of an idealized vision of what they looked like over however long you've encountered them. A year, 10 years, whatever it is. You're not seeing them. That's the way our brains work. It protects us from the world by graying what we're most familiar with. We only notice when major change takes place. That's what happened with me with Malapa. My own backyard. All of paleoanthropology's own backyard, the most explored area on planet Earth, had this thing sitting right in. Why? Because we knew it couldn't be there. We had a predetermined idea of what sites were going to look like, and we knew this area had been explored. We have to erase backyard syndrome in everything we do as human beings. It's about thinking creatively. It's also about constantly reminding you of the character flaws of the way we work as animals. Reminding yourself all the time, what am I not seeing? And then preparing yourself to see anomalies. And that takes knowledge, because you must educate yourself to know what's normal before you can identify what is abnormal. I've just written a children's book called The Skull and the Rock about the process of this discovery. Because for me, no matter what the end result of this, as we go through the next decades of hundreds of years of scientific analysis of these incredible remains, and the ones that we've yet to find, and the ones we'll find in other sites, it's the process that I went through that is almost more important, because it's the process of science, but it's also the process of exploration. And I wrote a kid's book before I wrote an adult book because it felt like the right thing to do. Sometimes adults won't listen. Secondly, children's writing is approaching adult writing very, very rapidly as we move into this incredible next phase of education where kids read the most amazing things and think like adults. And thirdly, because I'd never done it before, and I wanted to challenge myself to write to an audience that needs to understand this message. Maybe more so than grown-ups do. Maybe grown-ups already think they've got it figured out. Matthew says he wants to be a paleoanthropologist. My daughter wants to maybe go in conservation, be the next Jane Goodall, Sylvia Earle, or work with animals in some way. But both of them want to go into some fields of sciences. But they're both young. You know, they have every opportunity to do anything they want. This is their generation, their moment, and they've been involved in a discovery that proves there's so much more out there.